Okay, get ready. We are going to talk about ancient Greek architecture in the Archaic period. This is a lecture that has a lot of vocabulary in it, which is not everybody's favorite thing. So I'll try to be like really entertaining while I talk about it. Okay? All right, so a couple of general terms for Greek temples. All right, when I say Greek temple, you have maybe an idea that comes up: white marble, columns, triangle at the top. We'll learn the name of that thing, that kind of stuff. You're in the right place, all right? That's exactly what we're going to talk about. But we're going to learn some of the specific words and some of the specific architectural terms for those things. Thing one, if a temple has a single line of columns all the way around the outside, that is a peripteral, Peripteral temple. If it has a double colonnade, which is pretty fancy and comes around generally a little later, double columns all the way around the outside, that is called dipteral, Dipteral. Okay, that's pretty elaborate. We won't get to that till a little later. The earliest temples in this period were actually made out of wood. So remember when we were talking about sculpture in the Archaic, and I talked about how influential Egypt was? The Greeks kind of copy some stuff from the Egyptians. The Egyptians made things out of stone, right? And that sort of blew the ancient Greek people's minds. They were like, oh my gosh, if we make stuff out of stone, it'll last so much longer. Which makes sense. We know from the prehistoric Aegean that the mainland Greeks, the Hellenic Greeks, were already making things out of stone. But again, the Dark Ages happen, they kind of forget all that stuff. So in the Archaic, they start thinking, oh, maybe some of these temples should be made out of stone instead of wood so they'll last longer. We know about this transition. None of the wood temples still exist. They're all gone. They burned down or they were just lost to time. But there was this guy named Pausanias, who I've mentioned before, and he wrote the 2nd century Guide to Greece. Remember I told you about him? When we were talking about the prehistoric Aegean, he kind of wrote this like travel guide and talked about all the cool stuff that you could see in the ancient world. So he talks about the wooden temples and then the transition from building in wood to building in stone that the Greeks go through at this time. Later Greek builders use limestone, and then eventually they start using marble, and they start making everything out of marble because it's prettier. Some white marble comes from the island of Paros. This sounds familiar, Paros and Naxos, because those are Cycladic islands. So we talked about them a little bit when we were looking at the prehistoric Aegean. The bluish white marble comes from Mount Hymettus, which is sort of east of Athens. And then the really glittering white, beautiful marble that in our brains we kind of conjure up when we think about ancient Greece, that came from Mount Pentelicus, which is northeast of Athens. Okay, so that's where all the stone comes from. They're like, let's make stuff out of stone, like the Egyptians, but let's make it out of this shiny white marble we have. In the Archaic period, the Greeks travel more and become more familiar with different kinds of architecture happening around the ancient world, particularly, as I've said, Egypt. One of the things that they really like when they're visiting Egypt is when they're at Luxor and Karnak. Remember, we had those hypostyle halls, the halls with all the really big columns that held everything up. That is something that the ancient Greek architects are super into. They're like, oh my gosh, columns. Amazing. Let's make everything with columns. And that kind of becomes part of the standard of Greek architecture at this time. This influence impacts the entire direction of Western architecture, by the way. Why do our monuments in Washington, D.C. in America look the way they look? Because the ancient Greeks really liked what the Egyptians were building with all their columns. Okay, so think about that. There's a lot of lingering influence here. Okay, let's talk about some of the specifics. So one of the things that the ancient Greeks are really known for and into is math. Okay, if you had to take geometry or algebra, you've studied inventions of the ancient Greeks. The Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was a Greek guy, right? That a squared plus b squared equals c squared stuff. That's all from this time period. So one of the things is they kind of like the relationship between aesthetics, or what is beautiful, what we perceive as beautiful, to order, and how to organize it and have like a recipe to make things look beautiful every time. So they get really into ratios and measurements, and also just standards. Like, this is how things are going to be done, okay? So we have what are called architectural orders from the Greeks. And the first two come about in the Archaic period and last all the way through, up through the Hellenistic period and the late Classical. And then the third one gets added in the late Classical, which we'll talk about later. But the first two are the Doric order and the Ionic order. There are a lot of differences between the two, as you can see here. I really just want you to be able to identify this is Ionic or this is Doric. And I'm going to tell you the little cheat sheet. The easiest way to do it is you come in here and you look at the columns. Doric columns, a Doric order temple, is just smooth on top. It's really simple. So in one of my seated classes this semester, one of the gals in the front row was like, Doric's the basic one. And that is exactly right. Doric is the basic one. Ionic has these little swirly guys. So if you look at the column and you see swirly guys, Ionic. No swirly guys, basic, Doric. Okay? I'm going to tell you all the other differences too, but I want you to be able to identify them. So when we're looking at temples in general, Doric or Ionic, either thing, the altar is outside the temple and it's always at the east end. So another thing is aligning with celestial bodies, with like the heavens, okay, with the sun, with the moon, with the planets, that kind of stuff. So the altar is always outside and it's always facing east because that's where the sun rises, okay? The Greeks gathered to worship outside, not inside. The inside is only for the priests and priestesses who get to go inside and take care of the temple. The temple housed the cult statue of the deity. So the temples were dedicated to specific gods or goddesses, that's the deity, and they had a cult statue of that person. Now the word cult has a specific connotation now. It had a different connotation then. So cult isn't negative like, oh my God, you're in a cult, call your dad, you're in trouble, like it is today. Cult just meant what particular denomination of the religion is this devoted to. So in this case, instead of denominations today, like if you're thinking about contemporary, say Christian church, you have like, you know, Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics, whatever. At this point, the cult of a specific temple is which god or goddess it is. So the cult statue just means if this temple is dedicated to Athena, the cult statue is of Athena. Okay, not a negative word, all right? It's just what particular deity it's focused on. The cult statue itself is the grandest of all votive offerings. So you can take offerings and lay them at the foot of the temple, and the priests and priestesses will take them into the temple for you. But the statue itself is an offering to pay honor to that deity. Thus, the temples were really houses for the gods and goddesses, not places of worship for the followers. The worshiping happens outside. Figural sculpture is very important on the exterior of temples for this reason, because the people, the worshipers, don't get to go inside, so they need to have something to look at on the outside. So the exterior sculptures embellish the temple and make it beautiful, and they're also didactic, meaning they teach you something, they're supposed to teach you a lesson, or narrative, so they're telling stories related to the deity. Temples are often erected on elevated sites because they're very important, so they need to be high up. So like the Acropolis in Athens, which we will talk about, is on the highest point in Athens, right? Acropolis literally means high up, above the city. Okay, so the places where we have lots of sculptural elements are the capitals sometimes, the frieze is one of the main areas, and the pediments. So let's look at what those things are. In our Doric order, the one on the left here, sculpture appears only in the voids, the blank spaces, the voids of the pediments and metopes. So this is, see this whole area is the frieze. You've got our triglyph, our metope, and triglyph. So it's broken up, but these little blank kind of spaces, the metope in between these, that's where sculpture would be here. Also, in the lower entablature, sometimes sculpture. In the pediment is the triangle part on the temple, you often have sculpture here. In the Ionic order, this side, the swirly guys, we got the little swirly fancy guys on the capitals, Sculpture appears in the entire frieze, so we don't have triglyphs, so it's not broken up. So we can have lots of sculpture, continuous big narrative sculpture here. We can also have sculpture up in the pediment here. Not as much down here in the fascia. This is mostly just decorative. The volutes sometimes get a little bit fancy pants, but not always. And in the Ionic order, sometimes the whole column gets replaced by a statue of a lady. That is called a caryatid. We'll talk about that more when we get to the Acropolis. The capitals and the decorative moldings were all painted. So this vision we have of this beautiful glittering white temples being the standard for the time in ancient Greece, that is not what they looked like in ancient Greece, okay? Greek architects predominantly were interested in clarity and in order. They really liked rules, they liked ratios, they liked everything to relate to each other and to follow in these particular rules of the order, okay? The thing that the temple sits on that has the stairs go all the way up in every direction. The god or goddess can enter from any direction they want. That's called the stylobate. And you'll also notice that symmetry is a big deal. So this is perfectly symmetrical. You could fold it in half and it'd be the same. It's almost symmetrical folded this direction, folded vertically as well. So when we're looking at the breakdown of this thing, we have our stylobate, that's like the base that everything sits on. We have our columns all the way around. The flank columns are called the pteron, P-T-E-R-O-N. We have our peristyle are the columns all the way around. We also have the colonnade, which is the front columns. We have the columns in antis, meaning the back. The back porch kind of area of the stylobate is called the anta. When you walk into the temple, which again, normal people wouldn't, just priests or priestesses, we have the pronaos, which just means before the nails. The word naos maybe makes us think of a word nave when we're talking about churches. Later we have the nave. We'll talk about that word again. We also see the word cella. Cella we have seen before. That's what the central worship part of a ziggurat was called, the cella, remember? And then behind we have the opisthedomos, which is the house of the god, okay? So this is a basic overhead plan of what these things look like. Let's look at a couple of examples. So one of the things that we see, the Temple of Hera 1, this is in Paestum, Italy, which was part of basically Greece at the time. It's we'll look at it for a second. In what order do you think it is? Look at the columns, look at the capitals, the top of the columns. No swirly things, no volutes. So it is Doric. Very good. A lot of it has been destroyed over time. One of the things that really sets apart archaic temples from later temples in the classic period is that the archaic temples have a center row of columns in the middle of the floor plan, which we don't see after the archaic period. Okay, so again, this is not in Greece, but it's in modern day Italy in a city that was called Poseidona, which is now Paestum. So it was a city that was entirely dedicated, the patron of which it was Poseidon. This is also the city where pastrami is from, if anyone likes pastrami. Just a random little fact for you. It's just south of Naples in contemporary Italy. This was built around 550 BC. You can tell it's really early because there's an odd number of columns. So columns are always in even numbers later once we get into the classical period. This was a temple dedicated to Hera. So we had the center row of columns dividing the cella or naos, the center part, which we only see in the archaic period. It doesn't leave enough space to put a large central cult sculpture, which becomes really standard in temples later. And the columns have an interesting entasis. They kind of go up and swell in the middle and then go back in like this. And this is also a shape that we don't really see in columns past the archaic. Okay, so this is the plan, and you can see that line of columns in the center, which is kind of strange, right? Okay, so next we're going to look at a transition example between the archaic and classical architecture in ancient Greece.